They told you Africa was a dark continent, a land without history, a place waiting to be discovered. But what if the greatest lie ever written about Africa was written in books themselves? What if the story books left out the most important chapters? Because long before colonial borders, before European ships touched African shores, before maps renamed kingdoms and rivers, Africa was already alive with empires, scholars, astronomers, warriors, queens, architects, traders, healers, and mysteries the modern world still cannot fully explain. This is the Africa story books rarely tell you about. An Africa where gold was so common in some kingdoms that kings decorated horses with it. An Africa where universities existed centuries before Oxford became famous. An Africa where libraries held thousands of handwritten manuscripts, while much of Europe struggled through the Dark Ages. An Africa where cities glitter with wealth, culture, and advanced trade systems. But somehow, many history books reduced all of that into one word: tribes. The truth is, Africa was never one thing. It was thousands of civilizations, languages, spiritual systems, inventions, and kingdoms stretching across deserts, forests, mountains, and coastlines. And some of the most powerful stories were buried on purpose. Take the kingdom of Mali. Most people have heard the name Mansa, Musa, the man often called the richest human being in history. But few understand the scale of his empire. In the 14th century, Mali controlled major trade routes connecting West Africa to North Africa and the Middle East. Gold, salt, ivory, and knowledge flowed through its cities. Timbuktu became one of the greatest intellectual centers in the world. Students traveled from distant lands just to study there. Imagine that. At a time when many parts of Europe were still recovering from plague and instability, African scholars were debating mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, and philosophy. Thousands of manuscripts were written by hand and preserved across generations. But storybooks rarely show African children growing up seeing scholars who looked like them. Instead, many were taught that civilization only arrived when colonizers came. Yet history says otherwise. And Mali was not alone. The Songhai Empire rose after Mali and became one of the largest empires in African history. Its armies were organized. Its governance was structured. Its economy was massive. Then there was Great Zimbabwe. Massive stone structures built without mortar, walls rising with astonishing precision, architectural achievements so advanced that early European explorers refused to believe Africans built them. Think about that carefully, rather than admit African engineering brilliance. Some outsiders created false theories claiming mysterious foreigners must have been responsible, because the idea of Africans building greatness challenged a narrative they wanted the world to believe. And this happened again and again. Africa's achievements were questioned, its intelligence minimized, its cultures distorted. Even ancient Egypt was separated from the rest of Africa in many storybooks, as though the continent itself had to be disconnected from one of humanity's greatest civilizations. But geography does not lie. Egypt is in Africa. Its roots are African, and the continent's influence stretched farther than many realize. African iron smelting technology was highly advanced in several regions long before outsiders arrived. Complex trade systems connected kingdoms across thousands of miles. Art, music, oral traditions, and spiritual practices shaped entire societies with sophistication that outsiders often misunderstood. Then came colonization, and with it came a different kind of warfare. Not only guns and invasion, but storytelling. Control the story, and you control how people see themselves. Suddenly, African religions were labeled primitive. Languages were dismissed as dialects. Traditional knowledge became superstition, and generations grew up reading books that celebrated conquerors while silencing the conquered. Many Africans were taught more about European kings and African queens, more about foreign explorers and African inventors, more about colonizers and resistance heroes who fought to protect their lands. But resistance existed everywhere, from the fierce Zulu warriors of southern Africa to the women of the ABA women's riot in Nigeria, to anti-colonial movements across Kenya, Ghana, Algeria, Angola, Congo, and beyond. Africa did not simply surrender. People fought, people resisted, people survived, and survival itself became an act of power. Even during slavery, Africa's story was larger than chains, because slavery did not begin Africa's history. And it did not end African dignity. Millions were stolen from the continent, yet they carried language, rhythm, spirituality, agricultural knowledge, food traditions, architecture, and resilience across oceans. African influence reshaped music in the Americas. It shaped cuisine, religion, language, dance, fashion, even global culture itself. But storybooks often begin African history with suffering, as though pain was a continent's only identity. They rarely show the joy, the weddings filled with music, the oral storytellers preserving history beneath moonlit skies, the ancient proverbs carrying wisdom across generations, the markets buzzing with trade and laughter, the spiritual traditions connecting communities to ancestors and nature. Africa was never empty. It was interrupted. And even today, the interruption continues in subtle ways. Turn on international news, and what do you often see? War, poverty, disease, corruption. These things exist, yes, but they are not the whole story. Because modern Africa is also innovation, technology, art, cinema, fashion, entrepreneurship, youth culture, scientific talent, creative energy. Cities like Lagos, Nairobi, Kigali, Johannesburg, Accra, and Cairo are shaping the future in ways many outsiders barely pay attention to. African music dominates global charts. African designers influence global fashion. African filmmakers tell stories to worldwide audiences. Yet outdated stereotypes still survive. Why? Because old narratives are hard to kill. And because some people benefit from Africa being seen as weak, dependent, or broken. But a continent with over 1 billion people can never be reduced to a single narrative. Africa contains thousands of ethnic groups, more than 2,000 languages, different climates, religions, foods, traditions, and histories. No single story can contain it. And maybe that is what frightened colonizers the most. Not just Africa's resources, but Africa's potential. Because a people disconnected from their history become easier to control. If you convince generations that they came from nothing, they may stop believing they can become something. That is why reclaiming history matters. Not to pretend Africa was perfect. Every civilization had conflicts, wars, and flaws. But balance matters. Truth matters. And dignity matters. The world often talks about discovering Africa. But Africa never needed discovering. People were already there, building, trading, writing, dreaming, ruling, creating. The real question is, why were those stories hidden? Maybe because history is not just about the past. It is about power in the present. And now, a new generation is searching for the missing pages. Young Africans are asking questions, researching forgotten kingdoms, learning indigenous languages, reviving traditional fashion, studying ancient manuscripts, telling their own stories online without waiting for foreign approval. For centuries, others spoke for Africa. Now Africa is speaking for itself, and the world is finally listening. So the next time someone tells you Africa has no history, remember this. Before many modern nations existed, African empires were already thriving. Before many universities were built elsewhere, African scholars were already teaching. Before outsiders drew borders, civilizations already flourished across the continent. The storybooks did not tell you everything, but the truth survived anyway. In songs, in oral traditions, in ruins, in manuscripts, in memories, in bloodlines, in names, in culture, hidden perhaps, but never erased. Because no matter how much history is rewritten, buried, or distorted, the ancestors leave traces behind. And Africa's story is far older, deeper, richer, and more powerful than many were ever taught to believe.